Uh, Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time on their Friday to join us for Foia 101. I am Kelly Kaufman. I am the engagement journalist at MuckRock, and we're just going to go over real basics of the history of Foia, how to write your first Foia request, and some tips and tricks to kind of leave you with a few things to take away as we end Sunshine Week. Has been really great to be able to see people's enthusiasm for public records and government transparency. And also, I do want to make sure that, if you are working on your own public records request or have any sort of additional questions after this, my colleague Dylan Bergen, who is our data journalist, will be hosting a FOIA Friday. He does it monthly, and it's a general discussion about FOIA. There's usually some topics, but you can also bring your own questions. So just dropping the link for that if anyone wants to learn a little bit more about FOIA 101, that'll be next Friday. So if you want to continue your learning there. So we want to get started with just the basics of FOIA. Like what is FOIA? Where did it start? And I think this is like a great place to start here. Um, and then if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat, or we can also follow up afterwards online. Um, so the Freedom of Information Act is the federal law that allows the public access to government records, and is also kind of used as a term for the individual state laws as well. But usually the state laws have different names, but we generally use FOIA as also a catch-all term. So it was signed into law in July 4th, 1966, and then post-Watergate. There was also FOIA amendments added from the Privacy Act, and there are some 9 major exemptions. So this is really where it all starts. It's relatively new, and it's something that has really grown and contracted depending on the federal state laws, but that's really where we kind of got started. One that was modeled very similar to the FOIA law is New York's Freedom of Information Law, FOIL. And so that was really kind of a post-Watergate movement. And so this is an example of like a state law and how that was adapted for its own individual state. So state public records law is modeled after FOIA, but they do vary by state by state. You can see the varying degrees and who's being covered. It can be, in some states the governor's office is covered, in some states it isn't. Um, it's a lot quicker than the federal state laws when you're getting back records, but it's less consistently applied. So, it really just depends on what the county is doing, what its individual state agencies are doing. And also, there can be restrictions for state residency requirements. Sometimes they do not allow people from out of state to really, be able to put in records. So if you were from a different state, you may not be able to. But, here at MuckRock, we have some ways that you'd be able to do that. If you are interested in kind of learning more about your own state or states around you, if you go to muckrock.com/place, we have a state page for every 50 states, and so you can learn a little bit more about each individual state, what you're able to do. We also provide resources on local organizations that are advocates of public records law, so that's a great way to kind of familiarize yourself with your own state law, which can vary, like we said previously, to what's happening in the federal level. So this is just a little bit more about, federal and state laws, and it's really about, and a great way to think about making requests or anything like that is that it's from an assumption that the way the government conducts itself is the people's business. So when you're making a request, you have to know that you're coming from a place of, this is public information that I should have. So really try to think about that when we're looking about filing requests, what you're asking for, because these are public records and it is of the people. So, and you just also, it's a great way of starting to think about what types of requests you want to be asking for, what's available, what is, a public agency or their, government entities that interact with each other, and just starting to think about what is kind of like owed to you as a member of the public. So FOIA challenges. So we created, Michael Morrissey helped create MuckRock in order to better track and file public records requests that we also host and share documents. And this is often used by journalists, researchers, activists, and but it's also any member of the public who wants to file. So this is really something that we have dedicated to and can make some processes of filing a records request a lot easier. So this is MuckRock, and as you can see, if you go on our page, you can see recently completed requests on our homepage, and that's a great way to start if you're trying to look at public records requests, thinking of ideas of how to frame things. These are completed, so you can see how someone successfully got a public records request, and I think that's really important to have so you can, if you're really new at this or if you just haven't had a successful request, I think it's a great way to get started and to get some inspiration from people who have already been successful. Um, and then so when you file a request, this is what it looks like on MuckRock. You're able to fill in, the title of your request, be able to pull up an agency, and then be able to write a short description of what that looks like. And just so everyone knows, we're going to kind of go over a little bit about what you should be including when you do file these requests. So what you should do before you file. So maybe you have an idea of like, okay, I want to look at, a local restaurant. What is their like health code ratings? Like, I'd just be curious. It's a local restaurant I eat at. I'd be kind of curious what that looks like. So one of the first things we really tell people if you want to do a successful request is to get specific. If you're kind of going to agencies and saying, give me every email you've had ever, they're likely to push back against that. That is not very specific. And really try to remember that this is a request you're making of another person at an agency. And a lot of people at these agencies are understaffed, underpaid, and, are people at the end of the day. So really try to be able to cater your request to be a little more specific. And so you kind of know what you're talking about, and then the person at the other end knows what you're trying to get. So as we say, the more specific, the better. So if you have any idea of any kind of request, any kind of records that may exist. So this includes the name of the document, who has the document, so what particular agency may be have ownership of this. And also just, if you're reading news articles or anything, is there any references in the media or anything that may imply that this record exists? So it's really just familiarizing yourself with agencies and what kind of records they are producing in order for you to ask something specific so they're able to give it to you. So what are some things we can check? So for instance, just go on the agency's website and, you can on Google search, you're able to look up, PowerPoint presentations, CSVs, PDFs. So you can also familiarize yourself with what kind of documents they are already producing in order to better understand what you can ask for. There's also record retention schedules. So this, for anyone who's unfamiliar, agencies have different requirements of how long they have to retain a record. So if you're asking something from 1972, you want to make sure that do they have that? Do they not have that? Will this be a harder ask? Or will you have to go in person to kind of go through some of these records? Anything like that. So just remember that they do have some requirements there. And you can also FOIA just for their record retention schedules if you want to know a little bit more about that. And we also recommend MuckRock and Document Cloud. So as we showed you on the homepage, we also have a search option. Even if you're not logged in or have an account with us, you're able to look up public records requests. You can see ones, they'll be marked green as completed, which will help you understand like, okay, now I know this local agency has these documents that I'm looking for. Now I know exactly how to ask for them. And I know that because a previous MuckRock user has asked for something similar. Or it's also good to just double check that someone already hasn't asked for this and it's not public in some way. So you don't have to duplicate a request, or the records may be public already. That may or may not happen to you, but just make sure that you're able to, just double check, because again, as we're seeing more and more, a lot of these agencies, the FOIA officer may be the only person. They may be getting, hundreds of requests a day, depending on how large or how small their agency is, or if it's gotten in the news cycle at all. So just remember that the more specific you can get and the quicker it can go, it can make it easier for someone. And we also have Document Cloud. That's a service that we provide. And that's a great place of finding treasure troves of documents. So this is example of our homepage of our request page. So you can see, you can search the requests and you'll be able to see kind of who's requesting what, and you can browse through all the requests there. So that's kind of what I mean of just be able to like dip your toes into looking at requests. What are people asking for? Has someone asked a similar request? Because if you haven't done this before, especially if you're attending this 101 session, you may not, this is all new to you, and you may not know, like, oh, how do I phrase this? What does this mean? Just be able to kind of search through other people's successful requests can, at least for me, has empowered me to like make more requests, get a little more comfortable with the process, and knowing that, okay, I'm doing something similar, that people have asked for this before. This is not an unusual request to ask for. And so this is just an example from, I think, 2018. So it's, the Department of Energy, I believe. And yes. And so this is an example of a request to a federal agency that you can kind of mimic or copy. We also, as you see on this screenshot, there's a clone request. So if you do have a MuckRock account, you're able to just clone the requests and basically do something similar there. So this is like your agency's FOIA request log. So that's basically everyone who's like made a request to this agency, and which includes a field showing the subject of each request and a field for each. So it's very specific. So I think that's really important, and why we include a request like this, because it is extremely specific. You are asking a person for a specific document with, the subject of each request, and it's what they're looking for. So, and then what's nice also that I enjoy about MuckRock requesting is that, they'll include like pursuant to insert either the federal, state law. Here, I request the following records. So you're able to, reference the state law and why you're able to do that. So really, when you're thinking about making a request or you're kind of curious, really recommend just taking the time to look through requests that have already been made and see, okay, what are people asking for? And then see how that might apply to you in your life, or anything that might be a curiosity. Because as many of us know, just what FOIA can cover can be a lot. So it can be, the maintenance of your street because your city does that. Or as I mentioned before, health code violations at restaurants. That is something that's covered. There are a lot of businesses that need to be inspected, like have inspection records from the state agency in order to function. And depending on your state, it could be go from a nail salon to a morgue to a restaurant to various local businesses. That might just be something that is kind of a bit easier, and knowing that they produce those kind of on a regular basis. So let's get to writing a request. So whether you're doing this on MuckRock or not, that's, up to you. We just want to make sure that you're citing the law. So as we saw previously on that records request, that it's pursuant to the Freedom of Information Act. So that's on the federal level. But if not, if you're looking kind of on the state level, make sure you're citing the proper state or federal record. The name and description of the document that you're seeking. So agencies are not required to answer questions or you're not be like, hey, do you have this? You want to make sure that you have some sort of description of what you're looking for, and you're pretty sure that this is something that exists. And search parameters if applicable. So let's say I think the most useful case for search parameters is email communication. So if you're looking like, I want to see the mayor's discussion or the mayor's office about a certain subject, you want to be able to make sure that you're kind of limiting that because if you're just asking for all email communication, that could be considered unduly burdensome for the individual. So you want to really want to make sure that you're creating parameters that's easy to find. So, if they're just going through and searching through Outlook, are they able to, easily do that? So date ranges are helpful. Any kind of keywords that have to do with your search. Really for email communication, I really recommend having those type of search parameters. So these are kind of more optional, but still, helpful. Any kind of supporting documentation or references to the document. So again, why we tell you to go look at the agency website, go do a little bit of research. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just if you know they produced this in the past for like in some way, and either the name or what it contains, that can be very helpful. And any kind of relevant information about you or the context of this request. So again, this is optional, but for some journalists, it can be advantageous to make sure to say you're a member of the media because there's often a lot of requests from individual like uh private individuals that may include for like business interests that the agency may not be as welcome to or warm to, where if you say you're on the media and you've been reporting on this, that can be helpful. Or if you're a private individual looking for, a relatives or your own public record, be able to provide some sort of context can be helpful depending on what you're looking for. You don't have to, but just kind of think if that's relevant to the requests that you're making. And in general, you want it to be able to be specific, but also be simple. We don't want what we try to tell people in just one individual request. You don't want to have a laundry list of things for them to do. So just think about it, in your own life. Would you want a random stranger just coming like, here's 10 things I need, give it to me now? That's not exactly the way to kind of work with the FOIA officer. So really trying to parse some of these requests first. And really why we tell you to do a little research ahead of time because you just don't want to be asking for things that may not be relevant, that may take longer and you don't need. So really, that's one of our biggest suggestions when you're kind of getting into this. Do a little research beforehand, get a little understanding of what each agency does. Am I writing this request to the right agency? Do they even cover this? Is it my Parks and Recreation agency or is it, the Department of Energy? Anything like that, you just want to get a little bit of understanding, especially when you kind of get onto a state and local level, because is this the right county? Is this the right city that I'm asking for? Anything like that, you really want to make sure that you're not wasting your own time, most importantly, and get a rejection. And you're like, oh, great, I have to start over. Or, just being able to help the other person on the end. So, number one thing, just start taking a look of what has already been done, what you can do, really take some inspiration. So this is kind of the don'ts of writing your own request is really, don't bury this request on for a number of reasons, but you don't need to cite every law. If you're going for a state agency, you just have to refer to the law, the state law, federal agency, the federal law. You don't have to, no one's expecting this FOIA request to be from a lawyer necessarily, especially if you're a private individual. You do not have to bury it in legalese, have too many things in there. If there's maybe like a slightly relevant point of the law, but really don't add too much. Because at the end of the day, this FOIA is meant for the public, and this is not necessarily like you need a lawyer to write a FOIA request. Like it does not require that amount of legalese for this person to know. It's, it is your right. You just need to just cite the main law and you can move forward from there. And again, I kind of mentioned this right before this, but like having a really big laundry list background, arguments, at the end of the day, this is something that the FOIA officer is used to. They're used to filling out and fulfilling requests. So this is not, you should not really start at as a combative, you know, relationship. This is not necessarily something that you're like, you're hiding this from me, give it to me now. Really, it's just a request. And I think that that's a great way of just saying, you're just like, I'm just asking for this, asking for a laundry list of different documents, anything like that. That's really going to overload your request and really be able to slow it down a lot. So even if you're looking for the same document over years, maybe it's worth just looking for the document from 2023. And would they were like, and if you get that quickly, okay, great. Then I know exactly what I'm looking for, and then I can go back. So it's a bit easier to have, one or two requests, get those fulfilled, come back if you need more. If there's anything that you want follow-ups on, that's great because it really like once you're able to get some documents, then you can start adding on top of that. And at the end of the day, like I mentioned, this is someone's job. There's a human at the end of the line. And that's really something that you want to consider. And also, if you're able to see this person, at their job or call them on the phone, if there's any kind of, a specific request or like a question you have, just remember, there's a human. They're not necessarily trying to hide anything from you. This can be a relationship and a back and forth. And it does not necessarily have to be combative or like argumentative or anything like that. So really just try to think of it like that, where it's almost like you're emailing your coworker, like, hey, do you have this? And it's like no one wants an email of 20 things and be like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed. This just seems like a ton. These, like I said, they're government workers and especially on the federal level, we're seeing job cuts, we're seeing less people, these people who are already overworked. So just remember that when you're kind of going through this process. So we're just going to go through some examples of, what kind of requests you could be doing. So for this one, this one's a little fun. So you also remember, like, when you're looking at requests, maybe have a little fun with it, especially if you don't have anything to some deep, dark secret that you're looking for, maybe there's something a little lighthearted you can be looking at too. So this is a great one of a CIA training game called Collection Deck. And it's, obviously this is something that you might know about ahead of time, that you might have heard whispers of, anything like that. So this is why for like the CIA request, copies of all materials. And then I think this is kind of helpful when we're talking about specificity is including but not limited to boards, cards, rule books. So if we know it's a game, we may not know what type of game it is. Is it a card game? Are there rule books? Being able to just expand it slightly so it can include maybe things that you weren't thinking about. And then I think this next line, when we're kind of looking about what we're requesting, it says the requested documents will be made available to the general public, and this request is not being made for commercial purposes. So I just want to stop there real quick. Is just, this is the kind of context that can be helpful to a FOIA officer and understanding that you're not going to be taking this public information and selling it. You're not using it for commercial gain. And I think that can be helpful. And this is kind of the personal context that we're saying is optional, but can be very helpful. And then, and a lot of this lower section is something that we have on MuckRock is already kind of built in there, but also making sure if you're doing this on your own, feel free to, copy, take inspiration from, and, talking about fees, let me know if there are any kind of charges in advance of fulfilling my request. And also prefer the request is filed electronically and by email attachment if available. And then we also have CD-ROM if not, which sounds funny, but a lot of this stuff might be on a CD-ROM. So just being aware of that, I think this is a great example of something specific and able to be, it doesn't have to be, oh my gosh, thank you so much, but being direct, saying it's for the public and in order to create a successful request. So yeah, you see copies of all materials. So I think that's also something to be mindful of when you're like, I'm looking for all materials regarding collection deck. And you know it's a game, so it can be a lot of things, but you want to be able to get all of them so you're able to get a better picture of what is publicly available. So here's a state records request. So anyone who's kind of looking at state records can kind of take inspiration from this. So this is exactly what we're talking about when we're looking at specificity of email communication. So we're looking for this individual in the Oakland government containing the non-case sensitive keystring peacock. So it's related to animals. This is from one of our staff members who kind of tracks animal related FOIAs, which is very fun. Um, but you see, it's simple, but yet it really gets to the point. So you have the email of the government official, which is generally online. So you're able to kind of look that up through government websites. And then from February 1, 2020 to the date this request is processed. So basically up until they're processing this request. So this was done a few years ago, so it's not going to be 5 years. I think it was probably closer to 1 or 2 years. But being able to really nail down dates when it comes to email communication can be really helpful. And just being able to create parameters for this FOIA officer, like versus just saying, hey, I want every email related to Peacock and from the Oakland government. Like they might be like, I don't, what do you mean? Like, and I think this is a great way of being non-case sensitive. So that means if it's a capital P or if there's something like that, I think that's a great way of including kind of parameters on that. So just be mindful of that when you're kind of writing this out. And you kind of have to take yourself out of what you think you're requesting to be like, okay, if I'm sending this to someone who has no idea what I'm talking about, does this make sense? And that's what I kind of think of. It's like, okay, just reread it, read it out loud. Like if you got this email or you got this FOIA request, would you understand what this person's asking for? So I think that's very helpful, particularly with email communications, because it can be a lot. And so again, here's another one from New York State. So this one is a little bit uh more uh there's a few more items to this in comparison to our previous requests. And this is also something we personally did at MuckRock, which is kind of helpful. So when we're talking about identifying yourself, so if you look at kind of this third paragraph right here, and this was our documented COVID-19 project, and it explains a little bit about what we're doing. So I said we're working on behalf of news organizations, academics, and other public bodies to provide a clear, timely information for public dissemination. We have recently published our findings in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications. So I think it's helpful because, when you're identifying yourself as someone in the news media, you're also saying this is a public good. This is why we're asking for these things, and we're working on this project about COVID-19. So I think sometimes people might think like, oh, if you identify yourself as a media, would they get, suspicious? I wouldn't see it as that. I think it's just being able to describe how this is a public good and why you're using this. Because again, they don't know who you are. They don't know what you're looking for. And, these FOIA officers are getting requests from people of all types, all walks of life. And you really want to be able to differentiate yourself as someone who's like, I'm going to use this for the public good. That's also what I'm kind of looking for. And so this was obviously on COVID-19 in in New York State. So it's really like and really try to use any applications and or related documents. That's when you want to really try to have some catch-alls where it's like, okay, is it an application? Are there documents? And it's submitted by the New York State Department of Health. It says and or the Department of Environmental Conservation. So really trying to, if there's a few state agencies you think this might apply to, this can be helpful. And it's for funding to conduct COVID-19 surveillance in wastewater and sewer sheds. So it's really just trying to obtain any kind of applications and documents about funding, about how that works. So this is, and for us, this was an accountability project for documenting COVID-19, how a lot of these funds were used. So I think it is, really helpful to, this is an example of where you can kind of expand out a little bit. It's still extremely specific, but it has a few more requests in there. So just be mindful. I think this is a great way that doesn't feel like a laundry list, but is able to tackle a fairly more complicated request, as we can see in this chunk right here. And then also, yes, and then right below that is how this is in the public interest for COVID-19. So just being able to have some context about that, especially if you feel like, and particularly with COVID-19 requests, I'm sure they were inundated at some point with FOIA public records requests about COVID-19, especially in New York State. So it is helpful, especially if you know one of these topics that you're requesting or some of the documents you're requesting, maybe from an agency that's gotten a lot of media spotlight or a lot of public outcry, being able to kind of say, hey, I'm doing this for public interest. I'm not trying to do a gotcha kind of thing. So once you file a FOIA request, which, just going to pause here for a quick second. And also, when you're thinking about filing your FOIA request, I think it's easy to just feel a little intimidated by them, to think like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know, where should I start? And I always think starting local can be the most helpful, whether that's your city, your county, your state, versus the federal level. And obviously, this is just my opinion, but it's a lot easier to walk around your neighborhood or notice something kind of off, and then you kind of have the question like, I wonder how much they got for this, construction project they've been working on for 3 years. These are things that you and other people in your community may be asking, and you may be able to have answers for um, through public records. So I think that's just, when you're thinking about that, just look around you. And are there kind of like lingering questions that you ask when you're talking to your neighbors or anything like that? Is there something, or was there, you know, for instance, especially in like bigger cities, was there a big parade? Was there a big, NASCAR event? Was there anything like that? And then could you find out how much did the city pay, NASCAR for this event to put on? And let's say they close all the streets around you, and you like to know how much you paid for. That is a great example. And that's been actually done in the city of Chicago about that. So I think that is just an interesting way to kind of look around you and ask questions. So it feels less intimidating. And also, David Coulier at the Breckner Center in Florida also says like sometimes he just has, 1 hour a week where he does a FOIA request. And really getting into the habit of filing FOIA requests, you realize, oh yeah, I can just ask for these things. And then don't feel like this barrier of like, oh, I don't know if I can ask for this. If it is a public record, you are a member of the public. Like you have the ability and can get these records. So I think that's really important to remember, that like you're not intruding when you're asking for a lot of these public records, because they should be public. And that's something that the public has a right to know. And just try to think about it in that way when you're kind of starting out. So we'll come back to follow through. So follow through is okay. You did it. Congratulations. Your first FOIA request is done. What's next? So first of all, they might not acknowledge your request immediately. You're like, oh my gosh, like, what does that mean? So we really, really try again. Try to remember a FOIA officer is assuming good faith, is a person. They may be overloaded. And also, just so everyone knows, when requests come in, it's first in, first out. So it's, if some person 10 minutes before you put in 50 requests, they have to answer that person first before they get to you. So there may just be a backlog depending on what agency it is. So really just try to like remember that. And then if they may not immediately get to you, that can happen. We will say, though, again, muckrock.com/place. We also have agency pages. You're able to see what is allowed in your state and how long it takes for them to acknowledge a request. So also just know that there are different deadlines for each state. So just keep that in mind as well. And like I said, and if it gets to the point though that you're like, huh, it's over, the 7 days they need to just acknowledge a request. That's not even fulfill the request. There's a deadline just to say, hey, we got it. And they go past that, then you're able to say, hey, what's up? Did you get it? How's that going? So there's different ways to keep track of that. You can just put in your Google Calendar. If you have a MuckRock account, though, it will kind of do those automatically and have scheduled follow-ups once that's put in place. But if you don't and you're doing this by yourself, put in your Google Calendar or any kind of alert system you want. Or some journalists have done, Google spreadsheets and be like, okay, this is when they need to acknowledge it. This is when they need to fulfill it. And you can, color code however you want if you're having a few requests. So if that does happen and you're like, oh, they're past the deadline, you can reply like, hey, this is, just following up. This is the deadline and just want to hear from you. And when you're following up and if you're still not getting anything, we're really hoping we're not getting to this middle part and further. Hopefully we're not getting there. But if we are, follow up, ask for status updates. Is there any kind of acknowledgement? Is there any kind of process? And also really try as best as you can, especially if these are electronic requests, which pretty much all are now, ask for completion dates and try to get them in writing. Because then you're able to have a little bit more pushback, and again, this really depends on whether you're doing federal or state, just being able to kind of get a little bit of evidence if you get to the point where you're really like being delayed. And then we really hope you don't get to this point, but it can happen, and it does happen to people, is the appeals process. So some states have an appeal process for wrongful delays or long delays. So, again, really familiarizing yourself with kind of state law, federal law, what can be done to make these appeals and really nudge them. So these are really for, keeping track of your requests. So you don't just go, okay, I filed my request and I'm done. If you really want to be able to get these records, this is kind of the timeline in which you should do that. And again, if you have any questions or if you're kind of experiencing something that you believe to be a little unusual or need a little help on, feel free to contact us. Or contact me after this session if you're filing a request. I'm Kelly at MuckRock.com. You're like, hey, what do I do? We also have, MuckRock has a ton of resources of what you can do, what your next step should be, anything like that. Really, really hope not. But So, and then what else could you expect? So, I mean, there are delays. So that is something that we've already talked about of, agencies not getting to you on time. But what else could you expect? Good, bad, whatever. Clarifications. They might ask you a follow-up question. So this is really where starting your request out in a specific manner can be helpful. Because, if you're just being like, hey, give me a document about street closures, and then that's it, you have no dates or whatever, they might ask you some follow-up questions. If it's something that there's a confusion on, they're probably going to ask you questions. This is completely normal, but this is exactly where we're telling everyone to really start in a place of specificity so there's less follow-ups and clarifications. Because I mean, it's great that they want to clarify. That means they're willing to work with you. I think that's generally still should be seen as a positive thing. However, it will delay your request. So really just being able to maybe look at that up front and just seeing where that's at. Next, fees. It's not great, but sometimes there are fees depending on how much you're asking for. So, if it's hundreds and hundreds of pages, they may start charging you per page. It could just be, 25 cents, 50 cents, but that may happen. And there are also ways to kind of negotiate on fees. So again, if you're coming up on a fees question, please let us know, because there are ways to kind of combat that. But again, that just depends. So delay is also a common thing. And unfortunately, especially on the federal level, we kind of expect, and, obviously everything's uncertain, but there is a possibility more delays if they're, FOIA officers getting laid off. So what we recommend again is checking that agency on MuckRock, see what the average response time is. Some agencies take longer than others, and if they're kind of really not doing a good job of that, that is unfortunately maybe more expected. If you're looking at the agency page and you're like, wow, this request time is pretty long, like that might be more normal. Or, conversely, you're like, wow, this agency page has a short response time, but I'm not hearing anything back. So that might be an unusual either request, or there may be a reason why they're not responding to this request, etc. And then, kind of maybe you get a request, maybe you get documents. Congratulations. Your request could be, a partial. They might fulfill it partially. They may deny your request because of some exemption or a claim that the agency does not have any documents. So you're like, oh man, that's not really like what I was hoping for. There are still ways in terms of appeals that can be made. If an agency claims not to have a document, there are a few um, paths you can take with that. Did I ask for at the right agency for that question? Like, do you think that maybe it's a different agency that may apply? If not, if you were asking for a document, could you ask for email communication about that? Were they just talking on email about certain things? And that's entirely possible. That's a great follow-up you can do instead. You're like, okay, great. Well, do you have any email communications about XYZ? Um, or like a denial. So a denial could be like, oh, because exemption this. And then that's really when you want to start looking a little more closely at the law. If there's any sort of appeals process in your state that can be done, anything that you can refer to and be like, no, I don't think that's true. Or are you asking for something that you can't get? And again, this is where really research comes in first, because while these final outcomes may not be great, just being able to double check things ahead of time can be helpful. Also doing a little research about, can I appeal this? Can I not? Do I want to? Or could I ask another agency instead, see what they have? And then another outcome could be transparency. You get it. You get your documents. And it's very exciting. Getting your first FOIA request fulfilled, very exciting. Um, and after that, is that something you want to share with your local community? Do you want to share that, in writing? You want to send that to a journalist? You want to post it online? It's really up to you, especially it's like in the public interest. Um, and, at the end of the day, you really feel empowered to do it again. That's really what we want, especially in these FOIA 101 sessions, is turn someone from just a private citizen to a requester and be able to, ask questions about your government or ask questions about the things around you, anything like that. And it just provides more information. You may get something interesting, you may not. And it's really just about knowing certain avenues that you could take in the future if there are questions or if there are incidences or anything like that. It can be something small to, an inspection record. It can grow far as a police disciplinary file. There's a lot of different things that you can obtain by doing submitting public records requests and just saying like, hey, that's cool. Awesome. Anyway, so just remember, or you could just have a little fun with it. Some requesters are having fun. Do you have a special interest that you have that can be related to any kind of public agencies? Think about that when you're having requests. And then you may learn more about your community than you never knew before. And just to end it out, I know this is a little short, but always be filing for sure. Once you start getting in the habit of doing it and you feel more comfortable, you definitely feel more empowered to just, ask your community a little bit more about what's around you and just, what you can do. So And I know that we're over time or we're just going to end time, but I just want to there's a few questions here. So I want to make sure that those get answered. From Sophie, she said, is it better to send one large FOIA with multiple but specific requests or break it down to multiple requests, especially if one request is a higher priority than the others? I would generally say to break it out. That's kind of what we mean by specificity or anything like that, because, if because what like the way that a lot of these people will get a request, the FOIA officer will get a request is through a portal or some sort of email request. So just imagine if there was like a lot in one kind of email. So if you do have a priority, send in the priority first and then have some other ones. And because we just generally find they're a little more open to having smaller specific requests so they can take a smaller bite at it. And also for on your end, you'll be able to get them maybe at a better rate because they'll able to tackle one at a time versus having to fulfill all the requests that you ask for in one. So just try to think about it like that. Um, and I hope that answers your question. Um, and then I saw from someone, if we get a presentation, yes, I'll put this in the chat. We do have the public one, and we'll send that way. And we'll have one last question. If one knows that a record has been previously provided to a prior requester, does the government body have the right to charge a fee? So that's from Gerard. I think if you know that you've gotten it previously without, if that person got it without a fee, I think it'd be kind of hard to like just reference that, but I think that's something where you could push back on the fee. You can say, like we have a lot of resources on our site about fees and public records. So really would say that just I think you'd be able to push back against the fee if you know that someone has gotten it without one. And again, that's also something just, personally from the MuckRock side, why we always want to have a lot of these records public. So there's not duplicate records requests. So, we really recommend if it's something that you really want to share with others, we recommend like, putting it publicly somewhere so then people can find it. Because, we don't want to be asking for the same records request over and over again if it can just be publicly available. But yeah, thank you all for your questions. These are really great questions. And again, I will be posting this on our YouTube. So if you want to go back and look at this, I put the presentation in the chat as well if you want to take a look. After this, please be filing records requests in every way you want possible. Join us for FOIA Friday if you have additional questions or really want to tackle this. And just a little plug, we have a newsletter every Wednesday. It's called For the Record. So that gives a little news about FOIA, any kind of news articles that are using public records, just some interest. If you kind of want to stay involved, there's a lot of ways. You can also go to muckrock.com/Slack and join our Slack channel. So if you do have questions, like we have a public FOIA workshopping channel, we share stories. It's a little community that we have. So if you want to kind of keep in touch with us, or you're like, okay, I'm jumping in, those are great places for us to start. So happy Sunshine Week, everyone, and please enjoy the rest of your Friday. Thank you so much.